Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. For the last couple of weeks, we've been having our floor redone in our living room. It's been a necessary job. The previous floor had been down for about 20 years, and if I'm honest, I'd never liked it, to me, it felt like we were living in an office. However, it was a bit pointless replacing it, as it was wiped clean, and one of my children was very vomity when they were small. And recently, after a washing machine leak, it had started to swell and erupt. The floor, that is, not my vomity child. And I was a bit concerned there might have been a body underneath there, although that might be to do with me watching and reading a bit too much Nordic noir. Fortunately, there wasn't a body under there, a lot of swollen floorboards, but nothing that would require a police investigation, just a skilled handy person. We chose the replacement floor, herringbone, if you're interested, looks lovely, and we book in the handyman to come and do this. We had to wait quite a while for this, for a variety of not relevant reasons. Annoying, but not relevant. And then the time comes and the work starts. Now, I like to think I'm an even-tempered person most of the time. I've worked in mental health services for the early part of my career, and I can diffuse a lot of tricky situations. And yet, I did find this process incredibly frustrating. I found myself turning into Greta Garbo at times, wandering around the house muttering, "I want to be left alone." I knew that there'd be noise. I knew that there'd be mess. What I didn't realise was that it would take as long as it did, or that I'd be as annoyed as I was. We've all heard the phrase, "a bad workman blames his tools." Well, who knew that this is actually true? It happens for real. To clarify, not that I'm saying he was a bad workman. Technically, he was absolutely fine. The floor looks lovely and so much better than what we had before. I mean, even before it started to become a health hazard. But it was his attitude that I really struggled with. Our house has some, let's call them interesting quirks, metal door frames being one of them. And these need drilling and cutting. He was not happy about what this did to the blades of his drills. As soon as either myself or my husband went anywhere near the living room, the handyman would race towards us, waving his blades and complaining that they'd been blunted quickly, and he'd then look at us expectantly. I'm not actually sure what he wanted from this exchange. I mean, I find it difficult to get enthusiastic about DIY at the best of times, let alone comment on the longevity of a blade. There was also a lot of huffing and puffing. I did have to hold my tongue at several points because there was a huge amount of blaming going on. And it was only when I met up with a good friend of mine during the week, Ruth Wood, also a fellow podcaster. Check out her podcast, Frustrated and Exhausted. This certainly summed me up that time. And I was regaling her with my tales of woe. She smiled wryly and said, "Well, a bad workman blames his tools, and there's a podcast episode for you." And I realised she was absolutely spot on. There's a lot of psychodynamics going on here that I was stuck in the middle of, and I wasn't even realising it. So what's going on here? What happens when someone is blaming something else? To start with, you won't be surprised we have a couple of defence mechanisms at play. Quick recap around defence mechanisms. We all have them. We all need them. They help us keep us feel safe. And what we're trying to avoid is feeling anxious. And we want to avoid this at all costs. This can include feelings of guilt, feelings of blame and of shame. And sometimes they work really well for us, as feeling anxious in that moment isn't going to help us. So, as a coach, if I'm working with someone who's presenting with some defence mechanisms, I am not going to storm in and try and dismantle them, as that isn't going to be helpful. I might choose how I phrase my questions to evoke some awareness, But it also might not be the time to do that. Sometimes defence mechanisms mean that we can't see the wood for the trees because they're getting in the way of what we're really feeling and making any progress. Now, this is where it might be helpful to pay a bit closer attention to them. A key defence mechanism that comes out to play here is rationalisation. Rationalisation in this case is where we blame the tools for our part in a situation. So if a job can't be completed properly, it's because the tools aren't right for the job. Now, even if this were to be the case, a non-defensive response would be to work out what tools would be needed and obtain these. So to give you an example, let's say I'm doing a bit of crochet. I read down the pattern and realise that one part of it requires a different size of hook, which, unbelievably, given the size of my crochet accessories stash, I don't have. I can either blame the other hooks for not being the size that I need, blame the pattern for not being consistent or specific, or I can source the size of the hook that I do need. When we rationalise in this case, we blame our inability to do something because of something else, instead of taking responsibility for what we can do about it. It might be that I haven't read the pattern correctly, or it might be that the instructions were unclear. Either way, I need to take some action to sort this out. This leads neatly on to projection. When we rationalise, we're projecting out of ourselves. This is aligned with the process of projection. So what happens when we project is that we split off the bits of ourselves that we don't like and we locate them elsewhere, including in external objects. In the case of a workman blaming his tools, what's happening here is they're unhappy or uncomfortable or frustrated with being unable to do something or to complete something, so they project this out onto an external object. So what's going on is they start to feel less anxious because, of course, the problem isn't to do with them. It's to do with the hammer or the saw or the drill blade, etc. It's not that they can't do the job, it's the equipment can't. Now, one side effect of this is that it can seep out onto those around you. If this is a dominant part of your personality, there's every possibility that this can impact your relationships. Think about it this way. There's an awful lot of negativity that's being pumped out into your environment, which will be affecting those around you. Defence mechanisms not only protect ourselves, but they also keep us separate from other people too. So if you don't feel close to people or you're struggling in your relationships, one question to ask yourself could be, what am I projecting or rationalising right now? My invitation to you this week is for you to consider where in your life you might have been blaming someone else or something else where you could have taken responsibility. To share an example, I recently bashed my car. This was completely my fault. I wasn't thinking at the time, I misjudged the size of the driveway into a car park and I scraped it all along the side. For a moment, I blamed, amongst other things, the gatepost. But I knew I was projecting. It wasn't the gatepost fault, it was mine. And I was cross and frustrated with myself, but I didn't want to admit it. The insurance company didn't see it that way though, and I had to concede it was me. So have a think. When have you had moments like this? And, as always, give yourself some grace. It can be difficult to admit to yourself that you need to take responsibility when you really don't want to admit to something. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. If you'd like to have a chat with me about psychodynamics or whether I'm the right trainer, coach, supervisor or mentor for you, then click on the link that's also in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. As well as producing this podcast, The Dynamics of Everyday Life has lots more psychodynamic fun going on, and you can find out more at dynamicsofeveryday.life.